Welcome everyone to Bound for Botany Bay, a mini-series on the trials and tribulations of Britain's first colonisation of Australia. In this 4-part series, we'll be taking a deep look into the lives of 4 individuals and their nuanced experiences of the penal colony. Welcome history enthusiasts to episode 3 of Bound for Botany Bay. Following on from our look at Arthur Smith Bowes and the life of a surgeon in the colony, we will now be looking at the experience of male convicts. To do this, we shall be exploring the story of James Martin and his incredible escape from the convict colony at Port Jackson. We will also focus on what conditions forced him to attempt such a hazardous undertaking and his interactions with the Indigenous people through the journey. We have James here with us.
Hi.
And an expert in the colony, Oscar Aries.
Hello.
James, can you tell us why you were sent to Port Jackson?
Of course. I stole 11 iron screws while doing repairs at Poundringham Castle. I got caught, and from there I was sentenced to 7 years transportation. I was then kept on the prison hulk Dunkirk before being placed on board the Charlotte that was bound for New South Wales on the 11th of March, 1787.
Thank you for that, James. So, Oscar, for some context around James's escape, were escape attempts by convicts common?
I wouldn't say they were common, however it was a persistent problem that the officers were made aware of. For example, shortly after the arrival at Port Jackson, some convicts had already tried to run away to the French ships La Boussole and La Astrolabe, which were docked at Botany Bay, but the French commander refused to take them on board. During the first 2 decades of the Port Jackson colony, there were 40 recorded escape attempts involving roughly 250 convicts.
James, what were the beliefs about escapee attempts in the colony?
Many in the colony viewed them as doomed expeditions and believed that escapees were destined for death. If they had escaped into the bush, it was generally believed that they would starve to death or be killed by the natives or the wildlife.
Just briefly, James, we do not refer to them as natives anymore. Now we would call them Indigenous people.
Okay, I'll know for next time.
James, what did people think would happen if you escaped by boat as you did?
It was thought that you'd be swept out into the vast Pacific and never heard from again. I'd overheard Private John Etsy saying that trying to escape by boat would be a very desperate attempt. But then again, we were desperate.
Why were you so desperate to leave the colony?
We were starving, the rations had been repeatedly cut, we were getting a third of what we were meant to. Also, with the arrival of the second fleet and more prisoners, there was going to be even less food to go around. I really believed I would have starved to death if I'd stayed any longer. This was a common belief. I had overheard one of the officers, Wat Contenge, state that famine was approaching with gigantic strides.
That sounds awful. Oscar, what had happened to create these poor conditions? Had the government simply abandoned the colony?
No, the government had not abandoned the colony, but to Governor Phillips and the convicts, it certainly felt that way. The government had, however, made an error. As discussed in the last episode, it was believed that Botany Bay would be green and fertile. It was assumed that the convicts would be able to farm and work the land with ease, and as pointed out by Arthur and Amelie, this was not the case. When the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay, Governor Phillips assessed this and moved the colony further up the coast to what would become Port Jackson. While this land was better, it was still not what the government had hoped for. On top of that, the majority of the convicts had no farming experience and were extremely under-equipped, which meant the harvest was not successful.
Briefly, to add to what Oscar was saying about the quality of the land, I had overheard a fellow convict, Thomas Wassling, said that he was struck by the sterility and miserable state of New South Wales.
Could the government not help in any way, such as sending in supplies?
They had tried to, but on Christmas Eve 1789, the HMS Guardian, which had 2 years' worth of supplies on it, was struck by an iceberg, losing much of its cargo in the process. The colony couldn't even help itself, as all the ships in the First Fleet were heavily damaged from the voyage. The only ship that could be any use in getting supplies was the Sirius, which had been wrecked while trying to settle at Norfolk Island.
So now that we understand the context behind your escape, James, can you describe how you fled the colony?
There were 7 of us. We had planned to sail north up the coast, hugging close to the shore, and our aim was to make it to the Dutch outpost of Kupang. So, over the course of a few months, as a group, we prepared. We did this by getting a small boat, a compass, a chart of the coast, and some food for the journey. Finally, on the night of the 28th of March, 1791, we made our escape. The journey took almost 3 months, during which we survived multiple storms and encounters with the Indigenous people. We eventually arrived in Kupang on the 5th of June.
Can you describe some of these encounters for us?
Yes, the first encounter we had was extremely positive. We had just brought the ship into land when the Indigenous people came down to us, and we gave them some clothes and other supplies, and they went away, and they looked very satisfied.
Were you surprised that this interaction went so positively?
Not really. We had been led to believe from Captain Cook's reports that this is how a majority of the interactions would go.
And were a majority of the interactions you had so positive?
No, we had mainly hostile interactions. For example, on the 3rd of April, we had taken the boat up a creek to try and get some fresh water. However, Shortly after, we were driven off by the indigenous people. We thought they were going to kill us.
How would you deal with them in hostile scenarios like that?
We would normally fire a musket above their heads, and this would scare them off. But sometimes it wouldn't, and when this failed, we just have to sail away as fast as we could.
Oscar, is James's mixed interaction with indigenous people unusual?
No, when the first fleet initially interacted with indigenous people, they received a hostile reaction. The first words said to the settlers were "wara wara," which meant go away. Spears were also thrown at the settlers, but luckily no one was injured. However, during these early interactions, there were also incidences much similar to the first one James described, where he traded with the locals.
Thank you. So James, after all of that, how did you eventually end up back in England?
Well, we stayed in Kupang for 2 months, but the governor eventually discovered we were escaped convicts. After that, he confined us to his castle until a British ship arrived, which then transported us home.
Once you arrived back in England, what did you do?
I was sent to the Newgate prison. However, a prominent lawyer, James Boswell, had heard of my story and lobbied for my release. Due to his lobbying, the government decided to release me on the 3rd of November 1793, as my sentence for transportation had expired.
To wrap it all up, James, how do you respond to claims stating that telling your story may have inspired further escapes from Botany Bay? Do you feel bad for escaping?
I don't feel bad for escaping. It was never my intention to inspire further escapes. I was simply trying to escape the awful conditions I found myself in and hoped one day I would return home. If people are to gain anything from my story, it should be to realise how horrendous the conditions were at Port Jackson, especially during the first 3 years.
Thank you, James. And Oscar, do you have any final thoughts?
Overall, I feel that James's story highlights how poorly planned the colony at Port Jackson was, and is a useful prism to examine the strained relationships that the convicts had with the indigenous people.
Thank you both, James and Oscar. That is all we have time for on this episode of Bound for Botany Bay. Join us next week where we shall be examining the life of Margaret Catchpole. Thank you for listening, and until then, stay curious and keep exploring.